Hey everyone, welcome back as we continue our journey through Manna and Mercy. So in our last video we talked about the wilderness school, that the first thing that the freed Hebrew slaves learned, the first lesson, was how to share, how to live by the principles of manna, the principles of each one taking what they need with no one having too much. And it was also during the time in the wilderness when God gave Moses the Ten Commandments to give to the people. And I love the way that Erlander portrays the Ten Commandments right here. You see the picture right here where Moses is coming down Mount Sinai, and the commandments are portrayed as a gift. And the first time I read this book, I thought that was so fascinating, because commandments often aren't thought of as a gift. Sometimes they can feel like a burden, unless we remember the purpose. So the preamble to the Ten Commandments begins, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the house of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. The Ten Commandments does not begin with God saying what God expects of us. Rather, the Ten Commandments begins by God declaring what God has already done. That we don't obey the commandments to make God love us. We obey the commandments because God loves us. That it almost reads like a therefore. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the house of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Therefore, you shall have no other gods before me. Now, being from Alabama, the Ten Commandments get a terrible rap. I mean, we are the state of Roy Moore, who has fought court battle after court battle and cost the state millions of dollars to try to install Ten Commandments in courtrooms and in the state judicial building. He has used the Ten Commandments and the rest of the Bible as a weapon against divorced people, especially against queer people, and so on and so forth. And I think part of the problem we have is that we have to remember that the commandments did not originate from a place of power, but it originated with freed slaves, right? It wasn't given to the people who were ruling over marginalized people, or who were dictating laws towards marginalized people to justify their marginalization. It was kind of came up out of those who were marginalized. It was from freed slaves. But the other thing is that in our individualistic culture, it's easy to think of the Ten Commandments, or really all of the commandments, as like individual rules. But rather, these were communal ordinances, communal guidelines, and they had a specific purpose, and we hear it right in the preamble. I delivered you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. That the whole purpose of the Ten Commandments is to help the people create a society that wouldn't replicate the one they had just left behind in Egypt, with Pharaoh and slavery and domination and oppression. You know, the pyramid, remember that? And so think about it for a minute. Think of the commandments. The first, you shall have no other gods before me. Well, in Egypt, who is God? It's Pharaoh, right? And if Pharaoh gets to be like a god, then Pharaoh can do whatever he wants to whoever he wants, whenever he wants. But in this new society, this manna society, there'll be no gods but gods. You will not make an idol. You don't worship Pharaoh. You don't worship any human. You don't worship any finite thing. Don't take the name of the Lord in vain. Now when I was a kid, this is the one that I used to think of. Was like, if I, something that I didn't like happened, and I might say, oh my God, kind of like using the name of God when I'm not speaking respectfully or reverently, that sort of thing. But I've now come to think more of the Ten Commandments, or the commandment to not take the name of God in vain, is to not put onto God something God will not own. So, for example, when we send our nation off, our soldiers off to war, when we start wars, and we say, God bless America. Well, I'm not sure God wants us to have the victory if it means other people have to die. But that's putting something onto God. It's making our cause God's cause. I think that's taking the name of God in vain. Or maybe the most obvious example that I can think of in my lifetime is when Donald Trump had had armed security officers clear out Black Lives Matter protesters just so he could walk to a church to have a photo op with a Bible. That is taking the name of the Lord in vain. We keep going down the list. Remember the Sabbath? Well, in Egypt, when you were a slave, when do you get to rest? You don't, right? So this is saying in this society, everybody gets to rest. And let's focus a little bit more on the Sabbath, because the Sabbath is almost a special category, its own special gift altogether. And so in the Sabbath, you had the Sabbath day. So every Sabbath day, everyone gets to rest. People, animals, servants, whoever. But then you also had your seventh year. So every seventh year, you let the land rest. The land had to be followed. The Bible is actually a really green book. It has a lot of ecological justice in there. And then every 50th year, kind of the 770s after 49, then the 50th year was the year of Jubilee, which was also thought of to be part of the Sabbath. And you can read about this in Leviticus 25 if you wanted to. But in the year of Jubilee, what would happen is that everyone who had become a slave would be freed. Everyone who had lost their land would receive it back, and all debts would be forgiven. So debts forgiven, land returned to the original landowner, and all slaves freed. So this is how it would work. Let's say there's a person who came up on a hard time, and so they went to their neighbor and said, "Hey, I need help. Will you loan me some money?" And the neighbor says, "Sure, you can pay me back." And the time comes to pay the neighbor back, and they can't. And so the neighbor says, "Well, that's okay. I tell you what, you give me your land, and you can keep working for me, but now I get the profits from your land, and I'll make sure you have something to eat, and we'll work off your debt that way." So then all of a sudden, the neighbor has now acquired the land. Well, still the debt is not paid, and so the neighbor says, "You know what? Why don't you just become my slave? I'll take care of you, but you now belong to me." The slavery back then was not like we think of today. It was economic. That when you got into a really economic or financial difficult situation, you could end up selling yourself into slavery to resolve the matter. But that creates a huge problem, right? Because remember, they're trying to create a Manna society where no one has too much and no one has too little. But if someone is losing their land and losing their freedom, and other people are acquiring more land and acquiring more servants, well, that's creating another pyramid. And so even though the commandments prohibited the taking of interest on a loan, it's almost like they knew they were going to mess it up. And so the year of Jubilee was built in as like this safeguard to protect the covenant, to protect the wilderness school, to protect the manna way. And so so every 50th year, all debts forgiven, all land returned to the original landowner, and all slaves set free. I mean, this would be like a wealth redistribution policy that would make kind of Bernie Sanders' plans look tame, right? Think about it, that every 50th year, how radical it would be if we created a policy where everyone was back to the exact same level. That was the intent of the year of Jubilee. And so then you keep going down the list of the 10 Commandments. You have some that are just make sense, like don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery. That's kind of a tricky one for those of us who grew up in purity culture, who were made to believe that every sexual thought we ever had was deeply sinful. I tend to think now that it means to honor the love that brings people together and protect that love, no matter who those people are, right? And you keep going on, don't covet, don't want what your neighbor has, or don't try to take what someone else has, and so on and so forth. But the thing to remember about all of these commandments is the intent behind them is to protect the covenant relationship, to protect Manna society. It's almost like saying, this is the shalom vision, the Manna way, the Manna and mercy way. And the commandments, these are not meant to be a burden, but they're meant to be a gift to kind of protect this new way, this new order we're creating. So we have the gift of the commandments, the gift of Sabbath, and then one final gift is the gift of worship. We don't worship God because God needs to be told over and over again how great God is. I mean, God is not some insecure person who needs who needs praise lavished upon God constantly, right? We worship God for our own sake. And I can think of at least 3 ways that worship sets us free. Worship sets us free from ourselves. It helps us live beyond ourselves. That if I am only living for myself, that's not a whole lot to live for. And I don't mean like my life doesn't matter or your life doesn't matter. It does, but it means that I mess up a lot. I make mistakes a lot. And if I am living, if the highest thing I am living for is just me, then that's a pretty low bar. But worshiping, looking beyond myself, looking to a higher power, if you will, allows me to not only look beyond, but live beyond myself in a way, to live for something that is more. Secondly, I think worship sets us free from idols. That in worship we name that only God is God. And that may seem a little strange because a lot of times, at least for me, when I think of idols, I tend to think of things like, well, back in the Hebrew scriptures, it was kind of golden calves and things like that. And in spite of the golden Donald Trump that has made its appearance lately, I tend to think of idols today more as anything that promises ultimate fulfillment outside of God. So greed, success, power, sex, you name it, we could go on and on and on. And it's not necessarily that idols are things that are bad in and of themselves, but when they become our ultimate ambition, our ultimate focus, then they can become this addiction, right? That we never get enough. So we never get enough money or we never get enough power, and we have to keep pursuing more and more and more. That worshiping God as God sets us free from the idols that tempt us, right? And the last thing is that worship is a direct threat to all the powers of oppression. Why? What does the powers of oppression want you to know? They want you to believe that their power is absolute. But we believe only one power is absolute. That is God, right? There's a reason why slave owners in this country wouldn't let the slaves worship by themselves, because they would hear the story of the Exodus. They would hear the story of God saying, I have heard the groans of my people. They would hear the story of God saying to Moses, go and set my people free. That worship is a profoundly subversive act because it calls into question every power and principality that claims ultimate power in this world. And I think that is one of the places where in times of oppression, in times of great injustice, we can find great hope. It's kind of the whole Martin Luther King quote, right? The famous quote, the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Why? Because the powers of oppression never will have the last say. God always does. Only God is God. So the gifts to protect covenant relationship, the commands, worship, and setting us free from idols, and then the gift of Sabbath. And again, remember the point of all these is not just for individual rules or kind of individual practices, but it's to hold our communities together in such a way that we can be a community of manna and mercy, a community of shalom, a community different than the pyramid, different than Pharaoh's Egypt. All right, everyone, thanks so much. Hope you're having a good week, and I'll be back on here later for actually my very favorite part of Manna and Mercy. It's the part about where not everything biblical is Christ-like. All right, thanks everyone. Take care.